The auction was loud, filled with shouts, laughter, and the clatter of bids. But then one dog was dragged forward, a massive, weary shepherd mix. His ribs showed through his fur, his head hung low, and his eyes carried nothing but defeat. Silence fell. No one raised a hand. Whispers rippled. Useless. Dangerous. Worthless. The auctioneer's voice grew desperate, lowering the price again and again, but still no takers. Just when it seemed the dog would be cast aside forever, a young man stood. "I'll take him," he said firmly. Gasps filled the air. People called him foolish. No one could have imagined how this one choice would change everything. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The auction grounds buzzed with energy, the air thick with the sound of chatter, laughter, and the rhythmic call of the auctioneer. Families clapped as each dog found an owner, the sound of excitement filling every corner. But amid the celebration, a shadow lingered, an unease waiting for its turn. In the far pen stood a dog that had drawn little notice. His time on the stage was coming, but unlike the others, his fate promised no joy. When the handler tugged him forward, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A massive shepherd mix emerged, his fur patchy, ribs faintly visible beneath the dull coat. His head drooped low, his steps slow, as though every movement carried the weight of defeat. His tongue lolled from exhaustion, his eyes glazed not with excitement but with despair. The auctioneer's voice rang out, firm but strained. "Lot number 37, strong working dog, who will start the bidding?" The silence that followed was deafening. Where applause had roared minutes earlier, now there was only hesitation. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Too old. Looks sick. Probably dangerous. Parents pulled children closer, and seasoned buyers shook their heads. No hands lifted. The shepherd stood trembling in the ring, the laughter and noise around him a cruel reminder of his rejection. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the price, his voice tinged with desperation. Still nothing. The once booming crowd now seemed indifferent, almost impatient for the next lot. The dog's gaze swept the faces, searching, pleading, but finding only avoidance. In that moment, under the glow of chandeliers and judgmental stares, he became invisible, the forgotten soul of the auction. The shepherd mix stood motionless in the auction ring, yet every inch of his body told a story of suffering. His coat, once golden and proud, was mottled with scars and bald patches. A jagged line across his flank hinted at old wounds that had never healed properly. His paws, cracked and raw, shifted uneasily on the dirt floor, while his ribs pressed against his skin like prison bars. The crowd saw only ugliness and weakness, but beneath his weary frame lay a history of survival. Each scar was a chapter written by neglect, abandonment, and cruelty, a story no one wanted to read. He lowered his head, avoiding the harsh stares, his ears flattened tight against his skull. Every shout of the auctioneer made him flinch, as if expecting another blow. His tail, once a proud banner, now lay limp and lifeless, dragging in the dust. To many, he looked broken beyond repair. To others, he was a risk, a liability no family wanted to bear. The whispers grew harsher, biting like knives. Worthless mutt, don't waste your money. He wasn't just unwanted, he was condemned, his spirit crushed under the weight of their judgment. Yet in his eyes, hidden beneath the layers of fear, flickered a spark the crowd failed to see. It wasn't aggression, as they claimed. It wasn't hatred, as they believed. It was longing, a desperate plea for someone to look past the scars and see the heart that still beat with hope. Each time his paw shifted, pressing weakly into the dirt, it was as though he was reaching out, begging for a chance. But no one reached back. The world had turned its back on him, branding him unworthy of love. And so, in that moment, the rejected dog stood not as a threat, but as a silent reminder of how cruel indifference can be. Just as the auctioneer's voice began to falter, a ripple of movement stirred at the back of the tent. A young man, no older than his early 20s, stepped through the crowd. His clothes were plain, his hands calloused from labor, but his eyes carried a quiet determination that cut through the noise. He hadn't come with the wealth of seasoned buyers or the polished confidence of breeders. He had come with something different. As others laughed and turned away from the trembling shepherd, his gaze locked firmly on the dog. Where the crowd saw a burden, he saw a soul on the edge of giving up. The young man's heart tightened as he watched the shepherd cower beneath the auction lights. He saw not just scars but stories of pain, endurance, and survival. The dog's body was battered, but there was something in those eyes that spoke louder than the jeers. It reminded him of himself, overlooked, underestimated, pushed aside by those who only saw the surface. His fists clenched at his sides as the auctioneer dropped the price lower and lower, desperation creeping into his voice. Still, no one moved. Still, no one cared. Until the young man stepped forward. "I'll take him," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. Gasps rippled through the tent, laughter breaking out among the bidders. "He's worthless," someone scoffed. "You're wasting your money," another jeered. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then hammered the gavel down. The shepherd mix was sold. In that moment, the world didn't just mock the dog. They mocked the man who dared to see value where no one else did. But he didn't flinch, didn't look back at their smirks. Instead, he walked toward the trembling animal with steady steps. For the first time that day, the shepherd lifted his head, not in fear but in fragile, flickering hope. The tent erupted into disbelief. Laughter echoed off the canvas walls, sharp and cutting, as the young man reached for the leash. "Look at him," someone shouted, pointing at the battered shepherd. "That mutt won't last a week." Another bidder chuckled, shaking his head. "He's throwing his money away." Even the auctioneer, though grateful for the sale, muttered under his breath, "Poor boy doesn't know what he's doing." The young man heard it all, every word like a stone thrown in his path. But his grip on the leash tightened, not in anger but in silent resolve. He hadn't come to please them. He had come to save him. The shepherd hesitated, his paws rooted to the dirt floor as the mocking crowd closed in with their jeers. His head remained low, his tail dragging, every instinct bracing for rejection once more. But then the young man knelt, bringing himself level with the trembling dog. His voice cut through the noise, calm and steady. "They don't see you," he whispered, stroking the air just inches from the shepherd's muzzle. "But I do." The dog's ears twitched, his body quivering as though torn between bolting and believing. Slowly, painfully, he took one step forward. Then another. The laughter faded into murmurs as the sight unfolded. The worthless dog, the one no one wanted, was walking out of the auction tent beside the only person who had ever chosen him. Some scoffed still, unwilling to admit their mistake, but others fell silent, their smirks wavering. The young man lifted his chin, leading the shepherd through the parted crowd. Each step felt defiant, a quiet rebellion against their judgment. And though whispers followed him, so did a spark of awe. For in that moment, it wasn't the jeers that mattered. It was the fragile thread of trust forming between a broken dog and the man who refused to let him be forgotten. The parking lot was nearly empty when the young man opened the door of his old pickup truck. The shepherd froze at the sight, his body rigid, paws scraping against the gravel as though the vehicle were another trap. The leash trembled in the man's hand, not from force but from the dog's desperate resistance. "Easy," he whispered, crouching low. The world had always dragged this dog forward, but now, for the first time, someone waited. Minutes passed, the crowd's mocking echoes fading into silence. Finally, with hesitant steps, the shepherd crept forward, his ribs brushing the doorframe as he climbed inside. The ride began in tense silence. The dog pressed himself against the far corner of the seat, eyes darting, chest heaving with shallow breaths. Every turn of the wheel, every hum of the engine made him flinch. Once, When the man adjusted the arm mirror, the shepherd growled, low and uncertain, his body quivering with panic. But the young man didn't scold him. Instead, he spoke softly, filling the cab with words like balm on old wounds. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. Not anymore." The growl quieted, though mistrust still lingered in his eyes. Rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windshield. The man glanced sideways, watching the shepherd's ears twitch at the sound. Slowly, he reached down and placed his hand on the worn seat between them, palm open, fingers still. He didn't force contact, he offered choice. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just before the truck rolled into the driveway, a single paw shifted, pressing tentatively against his hand. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it was enough. The man exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The road home had only just begun, but for the first time it felt possible. The first night at home was anything but easy. The moment the shepherd stepped through the doorway, his instincts took over. Darting from room to room, ears pinned back, teeth flashing at shadows. He barked at the hum of the refrigerator, flinched at the creak of the stairs, and snapped at the gentle hand offering him food. Daniel, because that was the young man's name, watched quietly, refusing to raise his voice. By morning, the house bore the marks of chaos: shredded blankets, toppled chairs, and scratches along the doorframe. To the world outside, it looked like proof of failure. But Daniel saw fear, not malice. The dog was surviving the only way he knew how. Neighbors noticed the commotion quickly. One leaned over the fence, shaking his head. "That's the dog from the auction, isn't it? You'll regret this." Another muttered, "Should have left him there." Their words stung, but Daniel stayed silent, sweeping up broken pieces of what once was order. In the corner, the shepherd crouched low, growling softly, yet his eyes flickered with something else: confusion, maybe even shame. Every time Daniel approached, the dog braced for punishment that never came. Instead of anger, Daniel knelt on the floor, whispering, "It's okay. You're safe here." Still, the shepherd's trust remained locked behind invisible walls. The days blurred into a test of patience. Mealtime became a battle of growls and hesitation. Nights echoed with barks that shattered sleep, each sound carrying the weight of old fears. Friends stopped visiting, unwilling to step into the storm of mistrust. Yet Daniel remained steadfast. Every time the dog lashed out, he offered calm. Every time fear erupted, he offered silence. And though progress seemed non-existent, Daniel refused to give up. Deep down, he believed the shepherd's chaos wasn't hate, it was pain. And pain, no matter how deep, could be healed with time. The world called him foolish, but Daniel called it faith. It happened on the third night. Daniel sat quietly on the floor, his back against the couch, a bowl of food resting near his side. Across the room, the shepherd stood frozen, torn between hunger and mistrust. His ribs showed under his thin coat, yet he hesitated, growling low as if expecting a trick. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. Minutes stretched into hours until finally the dog crept forward. His nose twitched, his paws trembling with every step. When he lowered his head and took a single bite from the bowl, Daniel exhaled softly. It wasn't victory, it was survival. But survival, he knew, was the first step toward trust. The following morning brought another unexpected moment. Daniel stirred awake to faint scratching sounds. At first, he braced for more destruction. But when he entered the living room, he stopped short. The shepherd wasn't tearing through furniture. He was sitting by the front door, waiting. His ears flicked as Daniel approached, his growl absent, his body tense but no longer defensive. For the first time, he wasn't running from the presence of a human. He was watching, waiting, perhaps even hoping. Daniel crouched low, his voice gentle. "Good morning, buddy." The dog didn't respond, but he didn't retreat either. That day, while Daniel fixed a broken chair in the yard, the shepherd surprised him once more. Instead of hiding in the corner or barking at passers-by, he lay in the grass a few feet away, his head resting on his paws. Neighbors walked by, whispering, their skepticism still sharp, but Daniel barely heard them. His eyes remained on the dog who, for the first time, had chosen closeness over distance. Small steps, fragile and uncertain, yet each one chipped away at the walls built by years of rejection. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Daniel realized something powerful. The hated dog was no longer hiding. He was beginning to live. The days that followed became lessons in patience, not just for the dog, but for Daniel as well. Training started simply, no harsh commands, no raised voice. Instead, Daniel spoke softly, his tone steady and calm, pairing each word with a gentle gesture. At first, the shepherd resisted, snapping at the leash and pulling with wild defiance. But Daniel never yanked back. He waited, offering space, letting the dog test the boundaries until his energy waned. Then came the reward, a soft pat on the head, a piece of food, or simply the reassurance of calm silence. Slowly, obedience began to replace chaos. Mealtime became part of their bond. Instead of dropping the bowl and stepping away, Daniel stayed, near, sitting quietly as the shepherd ate. The growls that once filled the room grew weaker, replaced by cautious glances and twitching ears. Sometimes the dog would pause mid-bite, studying Daniel's face as though weighing the truth of his intentions. Daniel never rushed those moments. "You're safe," he would murmur, and eventually, the shepherd returned to his food without fear. Every meal ended with the same ritual, Daniel whispering reassurance, the dog listening, learning that kindness could follow hunger instead of pain. Walks became their greatest victories. At first, the dog lunged at every sound, barking. At strangers, his body rigid with distrust. But Daniel matched his steps, speaking softly, never letting go of the leash. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, something changed. The shepherd glanced up, locking eyes with Daniel, his bark faltering. His steps slowed, his body easing for the first time. It wasn't submission, it was choice. He chose calmness. He chose connection. Daniel's chest swelled with quiet pride. Trust wasn't built in leaps, but in fragile, deliberate steps. And each one proved what Daniel already believed. This wasn't a dangerous dog. This was a heart learning how to heal. The whispers of the past began to surface one quiet afternoon when Daniel stopped by the shelter to drop off some supplies. One of the older volunteers recognized the shepherd instantly, her face tightening with unease. "That one?" she said softly. "He's been through more than most." She hesitated before pulling a file from a drawer, its edges worn, its pages yellowed with time. Inside were scattered reports, notes from animal control, statements from neighbors, and photographs no one should have had to see. Daniel's hands trembled as he read. The shepherd hadn't simply been unwanted. He had been abandoned, abused, and beaten down long before the auction ever began. The reports painted a story of cruelty. A careless owner had used the shepherd, as little more than a guard dog, chaining him outside in every season. In summer, blistering heat burned his paws. In winter, frost clung to his fur. When he barked, he was struck. When he grew too thin, no food came. Neighbors reported hearing cries at night, but no one stepped in soon enough. By the time animal control seized him, his body carried the marks of neglect. Deep scars, broken trust, and a spirit that had nearly given up. Suddenly, every growl, every flinch, every shred of fear Daniel had witnessed made heartbreaking sense. Daniel closed the file, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He looked down at the dog sitting faithfully by his side, ears pricked as if sensing his pain. The shepherd pressed closer, nudging Daniel's leg with his nose, and for the first time Daniel realized they shared more than just a bond. They shared survival. Both had known loneliness. Both had carried scars unseen by the world. Both had been written off as less than enough. "You're not broken," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling but certain. "You're just waiting to be loved." In that moment, the past no longer defined the shepherd. It explained him, but it didn't own him. The future, for the first time, felt like theirs to build together. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind Daniel would never forget. The sun had dipped low, painting the horizon in orange and violet when he and the shepherd walked along the quiet road near the fields. Suddenly, from behind a rusted gate, a large stray dog lunged forward, snarling, teeth flashing. Daniel stumbled back, unprepared. But before the threat could reach him, the shepherd launched forward. His growl thundered through the air, sharp and commanding, his body a shield between Daniel and danger. The once broken, rejected dog stood firm, no longer trembling but fierce, his eyes blazing with purpose. The stray hesitated, shocked by the shepherd's sudden defiance. With one more powerful bark, the intruder retreated, slinking back into the shadows. Daniel's breath came fast, his heart racing as he looked down at the dog standing protectively at his side. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the shepherd turned his head, locking eyes with Daniel. There was no fear there anymore, no hesitation, only loyalty. In that gaze was a promise, clear and undeniable. I will protect you. Daniel's chest tightened, tears threatening to spill. For the first time, he felt chosen. He knelt in the dirt, wrapping his arms gently around the shepherd's scarred frame. The dog stiffened for only a second before relaxing into the embrace, tail flicking once, then twice. Good boy, Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. You saved me. It wasn't just about the stray. It was about everything. The auction, the abuse, the whispers of worthlessness. All of it shattered in that moment. The dog the world had mocked had proven his worth in the most undeniable way. And as they walked back under the fading light, Daniel knew the truth. This was no longer a story of rescue. It was a story of redemption. Word of the evening encounter spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors who had once whispered doubts now leaned over fences, their voices tinged with surprise. That dog protected him? One asked, shaking, their head in disbelief. Others, who had warned Daniel he'd made a mistake, now spoke in hushed tones of admiration. For the first time, the shepherd wasn't seen as a menace but as a guardian. Children who once crossed the street to avoid him now lingered at the edge of the yard, watching with wide eyes. Their fear was giving way to something new, curiosity, and maybe even respect. At the park, the change was even clearer. Where once people had pulled their dogs away, now they stopped to watch. The shepherd walked at Daniel's side, his head high, his step steady. No growling, no snapping, just quiet strength. A jogger paused mid-stride to marvel. Is that the same dog from the auction? He asked, astonished. Daniel only smiled, giving a soft pat to the shepherd's neck. Yes, he said simply. The dog, once mocked and unwanted, was now drawing nods of approval, his very presence rewriting the story people had told about him. Even the shelter staff returned one afternoon, curious to see the transformation for themselves. They stood at the gate, their eyes widening as the shepherd trotted forward, tail wagging softly, no longer cowering in fear. One volunteer wiped tears from her eyes. I can't believe this is him, she whispered. We thought he was hopeless. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's back, his voice firm but gentle. He was never hopeless. He just needed someone to stay. For the first time, the community saw what Daniel had always believed. This wasn't a dangerous dog. This was a survivor, finally finding his place in the world. Life with the shepherd began to settle into rhythm. Mornings started with walks at sunrise, the streets quiet except for the sound of paws against pavement. Daniel noticed how the dog now matched his steps, no longer pulling away in panic but keeping stride like a true companion. In the evenings, when Daniel returned from work, he was no longer greeted by silence. The shepherd bounded to the door, tail wagging, eyes bright, his once lifeless body now filled with energy. The house that once felt empty now pulsed with warmth. The man who had lived alone now had a shadow, loyal, constant, and steadfast. Together they began exploring beyond the neighborhood. On weekends, Daniel packed his truck with supplies, and took the shepherd hiking through the wooded trails nearby. At first, the dog sniffed every rustle with caution, ears high, ready to protect. But as days passed, those same trails became playgrounds. He splashed in streams, chased leaves in the wind, and even dared to roll in the grass with abandon. Daniel laughed at the sight, the sound of joy filling spaces where sorrow once lived. The bond between them wasn't just growing, it was becoming unshakable, tested by time and strengthened by trust. At night, the quiet moments told the clearest story. The shepherd no longer curled in a distant corner but stretched out at the foot of Daniel's bed, his breath steady and calm. Sometimes he would rest his head against Daniel's boots, a silent vow of loyalty. And Daniel, staring at the ceiling, often whispered, "You're not just a dog, you're my family." The shepherd's ears would twitch, tail thumping faintly, as if he understood every word. Their bond had moved beyond survival. It had become something sacred. Two souls once broken had found wholeness in each other, and nothing in the world could separate them now. The night was colder than usual, the wind rattling the old shutters of Daniel's house. He had dozed off on the couch, unaware that danger crept silently outside. A thief, desperate and reckless, forced open the back door. The faint creak echoed through the house, but Daniel didn't stir. Shadow, the name Daniel had given the shepherd, lifted his head instantly. His ears shot up, his body stiffening as instinct surged through him. With a low, rumbling growl, he moved toward the sound. For the first time, his growl wasn't born of fear. It was protection, a warning carried deep in his chest. The intruder stepped into the kitchen, his shadow stretching across the tiles. He hadn't expected resistance, least of all from a dog once branded as worthless. But Shadow stood, there, hackles raised, teeth bared, his body a wall between danger and the man he loved. The thief cursed, raising a crowbar, but before he could move, Shadow lunged with a thunderous bark. The weapon clattered to the floor as the man stumbled back, tripping over himself in panic. Daniel woke to the chaos, his heart hammering, eyes widening at the sight of his dog locked in fearless defense. Police arrived minutes later, neighbors drawn by the noise spilling into the yard. Officers praised Shadow's bravery, shaking their heads in disbelief when they learned he was the same dog once mocked at the auction. Daniel knelt beside his companion, his hand trembling as he stroked the shepherd's fur. "You saved my life," he whispered, voice breaking with gratitude. Shadow pressed closer, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The world had doubted him, rejected him, laughed at him, but in the moment that mattered most, he had proven himself a hero. The bond forged in pain had now been sealed in loyalty and courage. The next morning, word of the break-in spread quickly. Neighbors who had once whispered warnings now stood at Daniel's gate, their eyes wide with amazement. "That dog saved your life?" one asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Another shook his head slowly. "I guess we were wrong about him." Children who had once clung to their parents now leaned forward eagerly, pointing at Shadow with wide-eyed admiration. For the first time, the dog who had been branded as dangerous was being called something else, a hero. Daniel watched quietly, pride swelling in his chest as Shadow sat calmly at his side, head held high. At the park, the transformation was undeniable. People stopped mid-walk to greet Shadow, offering gentle smiles and cautious hands. He sniffed them curiously, tail wagging softly, no longer the snarling outcast but a calm presence that drew respect. Someone pulled out their phone, snapping a picture. Within hours, the story spread online. Rejected dog turns protector. Comments poured in from strangers, some astonished, others moved to tears. The once-forgotten shepherd was becoming a symbol of resilience, his scars no longer marks of failure but proof of survival. The world that had turned away was finally turning toward him. Even the shelter staff returned to see him, their expressions full of awe. One volunteer, the same who had stamped his file with unadoptable, crouched down, tears filling her eyes. "I was wrong," she whispered, extending her hand. To everyone's amazement, Shadow leaned forward, sniffed, and allowed her touch. Daniel placed a hand gently on his dog's back, his voice steady. He was never broken. He just needed a chance. The crowd around them nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through. Shadow had not only redeemed himself, he had redeemed their faith in second chances. Respect wasn't just given that day, it was earned forever. The house that once echoed, with silence now thrummed with life. Every corner carried signs of Shadow's presence, paw prints on the porch, a worn blanket by the bed, and a wagging tail that greeted Daniel each evening. Gone was the trembling, broken dog from the auction. Ring. In his place stood a loyal companion, strong, proud, and unyielding in his devotion. Daniel often sat on the porch at dusk watching Shadow patrol the yard with quiet confidence. The same dog who had once been labeled worthless was now his family, his protector, and the heartbeat that filled the emptiness of his home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel knelt beside Shadow, running his fingers through the dog's thick fur. "They all gave up on you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But you never gave up on yourself. You just needed someone to believe in you." Shadow pressed his head gently against Daniel's chest, his tail thumping slowly, as if to say he understood. In that moment, Daniel realized their story wasn't about rescue alone. It was about redemption. They had healed each other, proving that even the most broken souls could rise again. Their journey became a reminder, whispered through the town and beyond, that worth isn't measured by scars but by the love we give and receive. Shadow had gone from rejected to revered, from hated to honored, his story moving everyone who heard it. And as Daniel looked out at the fading light, he spoke the words that had lived in his heart since that first day at the auction. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the one the world rejects is the one who saves you." Shadow lifted his gaze toward the horizon, his eyes glowing with loyalty. Together, man and dog sat in silence, their bond unbreakable, their story eternal.